I've identified as a Unitarian Universalist since 1991. When Linda and I moved to the Twin Cities, we decided to do some church shopping, and we found our initial home at First Universalist in Minneapolis, which wasn't far from the place we were renting, and we became members within the first year. Linda and I were both a bit shy of 30 years old at the time. Linda was raised in a large downtown Methodist church in Indianapolis. Me, I was raised not in a church, but as a family, part of a family that identified as Catholic. But I was and continued to be a joiner, and I understood the power of community. As young people settling down in a big city without family in the area, we knew we needed some base. Somewhere, if you know what hit the fan, we would have comfort and support beyond our peers. Honestly, it never occurred to me that I would become a regular churchgoer for the next 30 years. And even listening to Bruce play the recorder of "There Is a Balm in Gilead" or whatever that title is, I'm like, oh my God, that actually brings me comfort. Like, I love hymns now. It's just not at all what I would have expected or told you would have happened 30 years ago. Really, having moved every 3 years when growing up, I feel like constant change is part of my DNA, and yet this faith has been a thread that I have not let go of throughout the decades. Quite honestly, I imagine myself staying a practicing UU and connected to a congregation until I die. And I know that if I'm cognizant of my dying, there will be a sense of relief, knowing that whatever congregation I'm part of will hold those who love me through the start of the grieving process. Someone will sit with them as I do when I sit with families and help guide them in the planning of a celebration of life. I know my family will sit in the same location, either on pews or chairs or benches, as bereaved families have sat for decades, up in the front of the sanctuary or other gathering places made holy by their presence. I know they'll sit with Kleenex nearby as words and music of comfort carry them through those initial days of grief. I also know that the theology and the perspective about life and death spoken up at that service will be one I believe. It will be open and mysterious, curious and loving, and grateful for the lives that we've shared with one another. The words about life and death, love and grief will be universal, naming and claiming truths that are unique to being human. I also see the years ahead as I am connected to UU congregations as years of growth where I continue to create meaningful relationships and community. I know my connection to this faith will nudge and call me to practice the call of love in all dimensions of my life and in the communities I'm part of. I imagine being part of a faith that continues to evolve in their understanding and creation of beloved community, a faith that isn't afraid to partner with local and national organizations that are actively involved in creating a better world, a faith willing to speak radical love and inclusion out loud, and a faith willing to be changed by those who are at the center, and especially those in the margins of society and our congregations. I imagine myself continuing to find joy and connection and spiritual grounding through the act of communal worship, and delighting in the lively intergenerational nature of a church community. I see myself in a place where I come no matter how I'm feeling. And I can imagine being caught off guard on a particularly hard morning by an interaction with a child, just like the Grinch encountering little Cindy Lou with those big eyes that inevitably melted his cold heart. I see my future intricately connected to this faith and this tradition, forever comforting me, teaching me, stretching me, and showing me a way to greater love and courage and compassion. Maybe you're sitting back and thinking, oh yeah, me too. Or maybe you're thinking, well, of course you feel that way. You're a UU minister after all. Or maybe you're saying to yourself, I'm not so sure I feel that way. Whatever your response, I'm grateful you are here today. And however more days you are with us at Michael Servetus Unitarian Society or at other congregations. This is the only faith that I have deliberately chosen and loved. I've stayed and will continue as a UU, despite the fact that I am sometimes discouraged by what is called the UU trinity of errors. The errors that have been articulated about our faith correspond to the errors of what I see at America at large, particularly in the embedded system of white supremacy that's the cornerstone of this country. The three errors are individualism, exceptionalism, and anti-authoritarianism. Individualism, exceptionalism, and anti-authoritarianism, they feel very much alive in America today, and I believe we are beginning to erode them some within Unitarian Universalism as we begin to examine our own systems of white supremacy and begin real systemic change in our association and our congregations. Of course, we have a long way to go, and I'm excited for the journey, even though it means that we must continually examine the status quo and be willing to risk and change in significant ways. Some of you who've been around for a while may remember when Katie bought a couple of these books called Testimony. It's the essays on the new Unitarian Universalism, and it was published in 2016. Oh no, actually that's the wrong one. I'm talking about this one, Turning Point. You can see my cat actually ate that at one point. This came out the year I was called in 2016, and it was essays on the new Unitarian Universalism, which was edited by Frederick Muir. And Muir has an essay in there which he calls the three promises of Unitarian Universalism. So he pushes us to move against the errors, to leave them behind while leaning into the trinity of promises, which calls us into the future. And the three promises that Muir speaks of are generosity, pluralism, and imagination. Generosity, pluralism, and imagination. I've shared some of my thoughts about why I'm a UU, but I thought as I move through these three promises, I'd bring in other voices, and that's where the yellow book comes in. I pulled voices from this book called Testimony, The Transformative Power of Unitarian Universalism. That was edited by Meg Riley, who lives in the Twin Cities, served the Church of the Larger Fellowship, and also served Michael Servetus Unitarian Society as Director of Religious Education many years ago. Lisa and Diana will read short excerpts from that book throughout the sermon. So let me start with the first promise of generosity. Muir tells us that generosity is the heart of the Trinity of promises. He says, Unitarian Universalism, generosity is the core value in civic and faith life. In our foundational documents, themes of generosity radiate. We are a people of generous spirit. He asks, can you think of a time in our nation's history, in the history of Unitarian Universalism, in your congregation or in your relationships, when progress that you felt good about was emboldened by the values of scarcity, stinginess, or fear? He says, I cannot think of any. And he continues that every step forward, every progressive change that has occurred in our nation and faith tradition has been because of a generous spirit. Yet, he says, as Unitarian Universalists, we've missed many opportunities of promise because we have neglected the generosity intrinsic in our faith. I appreciate Diana bringing in that place today where we generate these golden rays of, that to me is a part of that generous spirit, that sense about we can create good in the world, we can bring more love. Muir says that when culture and faith are shaped by scarcity, stinginess, and fear, people are reluctant to move forward, to broaden and deepen and share what is best for all. At times like these, the trinities of errors maintain control and lead in directions of little values for our future. And so we acquiesce to a shrinking and static life. Kind of powerful words. Generosity comes in many forms. Congregations with a generous spirit celebrate interdependence, and they infuse courageous love, joy, hope, time, and energy into the life of visitors, congregants, congregations, and out into the world beyond our congregations. Hear these stories.
Scott Samler Michael reflects on the gifts that come from being a part of a UU congregation. We need places where we can be our whole selves, and communities that will hold us as we cry, smile as we rejoice, and nurture us as we connect the disparate pieces of ourselves that have been scattered by the cacophony of modern life. A deep-seated isolation lurks in the hearts and lives of many Americans, and its consequences are myriad. Isolation begets loneliness. It obscures our inherent interdependence. Isolation causes stress and shortens lives. It makes us believe our options are limited. Nurturing souls with the gift of human contact is a powerful form of social action. People long to express their deepest yearnings and to be held with love as they do so.
Manish Mishra Marzetti describes his first time at a UU church. We didn't know where to sit, so we moved up toward the front of the worship space, the seats not often taken. It was only after we settled that I noticed a number of older folks around us. My default assumptions about older Americans kicked in, and I immediately began fretting about what it meant for us as a gay couple to be surrounded by all these elders. If they knew who we are, that we're a couple, they would want us to leave the community, I thought. The service ended. I grabbed my partner's hand and we headed down the church's central aisle toward the back doors. Until, that is, one of the grannies in the row behind us shoved her walker into the aisle, blocking my way. She got out, looked at me, reached out over her walker and embraced me in a hug, whispering in my ear, "I'm so glad you're here in our community. Welcome." It was all I could do to not burst into tears right then and there. And still, decades later, I weep at remembering how welcome and loved she made me feel in that moment. To me, it was radical hospitality embodied. Every fear I had about being in that space with a community I did not yet know evaporated in that moment of unbridled, unhesitant welcome. Every stereotype, every stereotype I had about elders not accepting gays and lesbians vanished. It was as if my own grandmother were hugging me and welcoming me home after a long absence. It was, in fact, exactly that, a welcome back to a spiritual community after a very long absence.
The second promise is pluralism. A word of caution. I remember one time when a teammate of Linda's was upstairs in our living room and she asked me about Unitarian Universalism, and I used the word pluralism in my description. That expression on her face went absolutely blank, and I immediately recognized that in an effort to describe our faith to her, I chose a word that was way too heady and not clear to her. So I recommend, if you are trying to describe our faith to someone, you might consider eliminating pluralism from your description unless you go deeper into its meaning. And even then, if we're trying to invite people in, it might be best to use a word or description that connects more to the heart and is known to more people. So Muir takes time in the essay to better define the term pluralism. He said it's helpful to differentiate between pluralism and diversity. He states that the United States lives with diversity, as does England, Russia, Iraq, Syria, Chile, and many other countries. Diversity simply means differences. It's a fact that wherever you find people, there will be diversity. He says that pluralism implies diversity, but pluralism doesn't just happen. It requires hard work through engagement. We have to be intentional to create pluralism. It is an achievement. He turns to Eboo Patel, who I love. He's a wonderful multi-faith organizer and philosopher who says pluralism is an achievement characterized by three elements: respect for different identities, positive relationships between diverse communities, and a commitment to the common good. Muir uses the term faith immigrants to describe those of us who came into Unitarian Universalism versus being born into the faith, and he challenges us to consider those who have been left out of our congregations in our faith. He says, who might want in, but don't feel welcome. The bridge to pluralism, he said, it's not going to drop out of the sky or appear by magical thinking. Relationships are built by dedicated people from the ground up. We must engage each other, tell our stories to each other. We must want to meet and talk with each other. Put simply, he says, if we wish to achieve pluralism, we need to go out of our way to engage with others. I know that's not always easy. This practice of living pluralism may not feel that unique to those of you who have been part of this community for a long time, but I want you to know that there really is a way that our congregations provide people who have been in places where they may have felt spiritually alone or suffocated, air to breathe. The premise of the book Testimony is that we have a faith that literally saves people's lives. Let's hear a few more voices from that text.
Jim Key shares how our faith offered him a way to live through cancer, free of theological statements and ideas that would have been harmful. Not long after joining this UU community, he says, I was diagnosed with cancer. The prognosis was grim. I believe that my commitment to religious humanism within Unitarian Universalism saved my life. I had a grandfather who encouraged me to examine all things, good and bad, through a lens of reason, including reading, study, and research, considering alternatives, and honoring intuition. I had a community of heretics who supported me with compassion, encouraged my approach to restoring health, and never judged. And I had a family who were there every step and never suggested I needed to get right with any divine. All of this and more continues to affirm and strengthen my identity as a religious humanist.
Kay Montgomery shared, I invented Unitarian Universalism all by myself. I know numerous other people who have done this as well. I did it on buses, traveling up and down Livernois Avenue in Detroit. I was 17 or so, a working class Irish Catholic, living with my parents and attending a Jesuit college about 10 miles away. The Jesuits would have been astonished, I suppose, to learn that this is what they had fashioned. A teenager trying to figure out what religion was and could be, and whether it was even possible to be both religious and honest, much less an actual member of an actual church. I thought not. Each day that bus went within half mile or so of the Unitarian Church, but I didn't know that. And if I had known, it wouldn't have meant a thing. A decade later in another city, long after I left the church, I stumbled on a passage in a book that described Unitarian Universalism. I was astonished. This thing I had invented actually existed. A richer version of mine, a version with a religious, intellectual, and cultural tradition I couldn't imagine, but still identifiably mine. And then there was the experience so many of us have had of coming home, of showing up in this church and finding comfort and challenging people who insisted that I grow, finding ideas that thrilled and scared me because they demanded so much, finding a community of scrappy, smart, satisfying people who cared passionately about the church, about Unitarian Universalism, and about leaving the planet a better place. People who believe that they need one another for religious and social reasons, and for the work of making justice. This is what I've learned. For each time I don't reach out to someone who might join this faith, for each time I hesitate to be hospitable out of shyness or solipsism, I may be leaving someone's life poorer than it might be. If there's a teenager on a bus somewhere, and there is, I'd like to offer the good news of Unitarian Universalism.
Thanks, Lisa. And finally, the third promise of imagination. Muir speaks of imagination as seeing and thinking beyond the present. He quotes Warren Buffett's son, Peter, who wrote, "What we have is a crisis of imagination." Albert Einstein said that you cannot solve a problem with the same mindset that created it. So much imagination is needed right now. We can't be afraid to shift our mindset. We live in a time when media feeds us fear and division. We react to the latest bad news. What is needed is a proactive way of being where we work together towards a vision of a country with liberty and justice for all, and where we come to know and love all our neighbors. Imagination can help us, this little congregation in Fridley, Minnesota, think outside the box or outside of our current buildings or program or worship to envision other ways that we might gather and create a meaningful and courageous community. Please know that I have to quiet my own fearful gatekeepers, which get in the way of my imaginative thinking and believing in a bright future. So I can imagine it might be hard for you as well, but I think we can all be those people in each other's lives that help us remember to imagine. Muir cites Unitarian Universalist history to remind us of this point. He reminds us of times when women weren't allowed to serve our congregations or attend our seminaries. They must not have been able to imagine then what we have today. He cites that as recent as 1989, 66% of surveyed UUs made what he called a pessimistic prediction about openly gay, lesbian, or bisexual ministers. They weren't even talking about transgender folks at that time. They could not see Unitarian Universalism as it is today. We as people can be so limited in our thought and belief when we cannot see something that has yet to exist. For the first time in my life, there are a growing number of people, or a first time in my adult life, of people of color serving our churches and in leadership at the Unitarian Universalist Association. Will we be able to become a faith that is more diverse in terms of a population of people? Although I find myself stuck with that which I've only known, I'm working to imagine a time when our congregations will be more racially diverse. It's up to us to imagine and to build towards that future. Imagination is fueled by possibility and love and hope, and we can nurture such things in the life of this congregation and our faith. So let's just hear from a few more voices.
Meg Riley, who was the editor of the testimony book and is now our Unitarian Universalist Association's co-moderator, says, "Every day I forget how strong love is. Every day I sink into despair about this precious planet and the greed that is choking out life. And I begin to believe that there is no way forward. Every day I need to know that I'm not alone in my struggle to return to love and recenter myself in grace and decency. Every day I need to know that I'm part of something much bigger than myself, and that whether or not we can save each other on the planet, my tiny acts of faith matter. So yes, saying that Unitarian Universalism saves people makes many folks uncomfortable. It would make me more uncomfortable if I hadn't seen it happen over and over and experienced it myself."
Leslie Grover reflects, "At the UU Church, I am part of the fabric, and that fabric covers me as I grow spiritually and become the theologian that our youth minister sometimes talks about, while proceeding with the kindness our senior minister mentioned so often. I now understand what it means to live in faith, because this church is about more than the church itself. It's about building up others, ourselves, and this community. I can shine out my heart and feel that love and acceptance shine back onto me from those sharing the church experience with me in a way that transcends race, gender, social standing, and even belief systems. For this type of love, I am grateful."
We are storied people, and we are heavily influenced by the stories we tell. My hope is that the stories we tell will be rooted in generosity, intentional pluralism, and imagination. We have come this far as a congregation and as a larger faith, and it's up to us to carry it into the future. Muir ends his essay saying, "Let's not spend too much precious time on the past. Let's tell the story of who we will be." I look forward to creating that future together. Amen. Whether you have anything that you would like to share about how you were called into Unitarian Universalism, or where you see imagination playing into our future, or any thoughts about the three promises of generosity, pluralism, and imagination. Don't be too shy. Norma, you were asking about the author. Are you meaning of the book about the three promises?
Yes, I didn't quite catch the name.
Yeah, the book is called Turning Point, and the editor is Frederick Muir, M-U-I-R, and it's printed by our Skinner House Press, which is the press that's run by the Unitarian Universalist Association.
Thank you. I was just getting confused. It might be John Muir, so I appreciate the clarification.
Got it. Yes, I know it is hard, isn't it, when you have a name you're familiar with?
Jamie and Roger have a hand raised. You'll have to unmute. There we go.
Sorry, and I misspelled my name. What really resonates with me is the generosity. And I once heard at it wasn't GA, it was the what was
Mid-America.
Prairie Star at that time, you
Yep.
know, conference. And somebody was giving a talk on stewardship, and he said that, you know, talked about living your whole life basically with an attitude of generosity. And to me, that really speaks to me, and it also, it just gives great depth and fullness and to my life, if I remember to do that. I don't always. And in some ways it encompasses the other two. If I had to pick the others,
Yep.
but I think the others are also important.
Yeah, he really calls it the cornerstone, Jamie. And I do think there is something about showing up and being part of a community that's constantly striving to deepen and live out that expression of generosity, that it, you know, there's so many times during the week that I think about my own generosity and try to push myself more. So thank you for lifting that up.
And from Norma and Marilyn, I get stuck in ruts. This is in the chat. I get stuck in ruts regularly. So imagination is so important to me, and the others drive that for me. I see Janice and then Lynn.
I'm still a little confused on the concept of pluralism
Mm-hmm.
and how to explain it. So if you could expound just a minute or so on that, I would be grateful.
Or let's see if anybody else wants to dive into it. Anybody else have a definition or thought on pluralism that might help grapple with that word? Kathy Forbes wrote belonging. To me, I guess for me, one thing about pluralism is, you know, it's sort of like that idea of I don't see difference, which is sometimes used to sort of be seen as a good diversity, you know, I love everybody, where I think pluralism invites in difference and builds bridges among different groups and different ideas and different types of people. For us, I think as a congregation and as a faith, to acknowledge our differences and continue to deepen our relationships while at the same time continuing to keep that radical hospitality at the front door, and once you get into the door and out into the world. But I think it's a conscious intention of living in a world of diversity. Does that make sense?
That does.
Okay. That's just me spouting off. So, you know, take it or leave it. Did you say somebody, Lynn?
Yes. Thank you, Laura. That was actually a very good way of thinking about it. The other thing I was really struck by as you were talking about the three promises is that they're a really healthy antidote to fear-based decisions. And it's so easy, especially right now during a pandemic, to fall into making fear-based decisions, either individually or societally. And they never work out very well. So I really appreciate being reminded that we can make decisions based on much healthier values.
And I think we have to be honest with ourselves that in the middle of this pandemic, or maybe near the end of this pandemic, please, that, you know, that pool of the well that we can usually pull from is a little drier. So I think to give ourselves that space for imagination and generosity, it takes something, you know, like it's not as readily available, I believe.
I'll raise my hand. I want to say that a thing that I struggle with mightily is the idea of interdependence as opposed to independence. Conceptually, I don't have any issue with it. Living it out feels a lot harder. And even when you connect it to something like generosity, I feel like it's easy in a sense to be generous and still be independent and kind of not really honor the community, the interdependence of community in the way that I think we ought to be doing. So I will stop there.
Thanks,
Marie.
Katie. Yeah.
Marie?
I guess this is a more personal, it's not one of the three that you were talking about, but when I was divorced and my daughter was about 4, I figured, okay, I really need to start going to a church. A lot of parents think about that when their kids are little like that. And I went to a church that was really close, and it was what I grew up in, which was more of a fundamentalist, fear-based church, now I realize. And I went to one service there. I walked out, nobody had said hello, and I just did not connect with what I used to connect with. And I said, I'm never going back here. It's not me. And then I think within a year or so, Bruce and I had met at a divorce support group. He was going to MSUS, and this is probably between 35 and 40 years ago. So it was really early in MSUS time, or early for me. And I walked in there and sat down and listened to everything and was amazed. When I walked out, I said, I'm okay. And that was wonderful for me. I'm okay. There were people
Thank you, Marie.
I'm okay with.
I think that is a perfect way to end. I mean, that is really, I think when I imagine UU miracles, I think it's always amazing that we all find our way to places such as this and communities such as this, because what it does, I think, to both our internal selves and our external selves is super powerful. So thank you, Marie. We are okay. So I'm glad you felt that love and that you returned and continue to return. Lisa will now introduce our offering.